Hi, thanks for joining me, and this is part 4 of my 35mm film project. Now, if you've been following this series so far, you'll have seen that I've got my Minolta X-9 35mm film camera back out, blown the dust off and shot some film with it. So the first part, or rather the preview of this project, was when I took the camera down to southeast London to Marion Park, where the film Blow Up was shot, just to give the camera a quick test run just to make sure it still works. And then probably into the film project, part 1, I gave a quick run through of the layout and the features of the camera. And then in part 2, I went to Stevington Windmill in Bedfordshire and shot some Ilford HP5 black and white film. And then in the last part, part 3, I took the camera to Holmfen in Cambridgeshire, not far from Peterborough, where I shot some colour film. And this is now part 4, where we're going to see the results. So the whole idea of the film project was to shoot the Minolta X-9 alongside my Canon digital camera so that we can compare the results. So here we are now in part 4, and it's the moment of truth. So I've got this in the post. The films have been developed, and it's time to unbox, if you like, the resulting images. So let's take a look. So like I said before, we've got 2 rolls of film that were shot, and half in black and white, half in colour. So the colour film was Ilford HP5 ISO 400, and the colour film was Kodak Ultramax ISO 400. So this is the results. Now, just for information, I used Snap's photo services in Bournemouth, so I did that by mail. And also I should say that not only did I get the photographs developed, I only got 6x4s, but what I did do is get the photographs scanned as well, so I do have digital copies. So let's take a look at these. Right, so they're the black and white ones. And the colour ones. Good. Okay, so the black and white films, here we go. Moment of truth. So it's a long time since I've seen something like that. Right, so let's have a look at the prints. So here's the... So I should say also that this film is from the preview video as well. So I've only shot 1 roll of black and white. So I've got some contact prints and hopefully 36 or 37 black and white pictures. So looking at these are the shots that I took at Marion Park in southeast London. And they're in the preview video. So I never actually shot with black and white back when I had my camera as a teenager, and in that time period I never actually shot with Ilford black and white. So this is all quite new to me. So far the results are quite good. I've got matte finish on the photographs as well. I didn't go for gloss. So yeah, it's quite good to see the range of tones in these prints. And obviously I had an opportunity to shoot quite a few pictures of the same subject using different exposures. So it's quite interesting to see the differences here. it's interesting. It's sort of like some of the greys I would say are slightly on the green side. It might be the light that I'm looking at these in, but the greys are just very slightly green. Maybe that's a characteristic of the Ilford film. I'm not sure. But then from the park we went to the Thames Barrier, so I'll be comparing that with the pictures I took of the Thames Barrier on the Canon, and then we move properly onto the film project pictures now. So these were the ones taken at Stevington Windmill. Some quite dark ones, that's fine, but the sky is nicely exposed. The sky's slightly too bright there. Quite silhouetted, so okay, so maybe that indicates to me that the dynamic range of film of black and white film is maybe not quite the same as digital. So the skies are nicely exposed, but not much detail in the foreground, which is quite interesting. I wasn't really expecting that, so maybe that's a lesson to be learnt about digital. About black and white film. So what we'll do is we'll have a look at these in closer detail in a minute when I have a look at the scanned pictures, and we'll compare them on screen to the digital pictures, so we can actually compare like for like, which will be quite an interesting comparison, I think. Yeah, and I've got a picture similar to this. In fact, it was taken at exactly the same place with a digital camera, but with my Canon lens I used my 17-40 lens, but on the Minolta I've only got the 28-85, so I couldn't get the full windmill sails in this picture. So that was kind of to be expected. And then obviously a couple of different exposures. So we've got a lighter one and a slightly darker one using different exposures. And that was a conscious decision at the time. But yeah, it's quite interesting actually to see black. That's quite a nicely exposed picture, not with much sky though. So the sky is quite blown out on that image. Yeah, so that's it's quite interesting. So like I say, first time I've shot with Ilford black and white film, so it's quite interesting to see the results. So but the most important thing is I'm not disappointed. They've all kind of come out kind of as expected. Some of the exposed, or some of the details are a little bit different to what I was expecting. So going back to these two shots that I'm mostly concentrated on at the windmill, it's interesting that a lot of the details are missing in the foreground, which the digital seem to pick up. So that's quite interesting. What will be even more interesting is using the JPEG in Lightroom and processing it and pulling out some details to see if I can get similar results from a scanned JPEG compared to a raw file. So that would be interesting. So there we go. That's they're the black and white film. All quite interesting results. Time to look at the colour film. So the colour film was shot at Holm Fen a few days ago, and just like the black and white, I've got a contact sheet and the photographs. So these were taken a few mornings ago, bright and early, around sunrise, and over a period of about 4 or 5 hours. And the first shot I took was of like a frosty foreground. So on the brown bracken and fern, the foreground picked up the frost from the overnight cold weather. So that's kind of worked okay. That looks good. The big difference, I guess, is that these feel a bit more kind of snapshotty in a way, whereas with shooting a RAW, you can really bring out details and work kind of as I suppose you would have done in the darkroom, in Lightroom, using dodging and burning and things like that. But one thing I have done with my digital photographs of the woodland is to apply an autumn effect, which kind of increases contrast but gives a soft focus appearance, and I think that really works well in my woodland photography. Like I said in the video, I've not really done too much woodland photography, but it's quite it gives quite an appealing effect, I think, provided it's not overdone, and I don't think I'm overdoing it, but please let me know if I do. So yeah, that was the first shot, and then the second shot, oh yeah, I remember this one. This was going down a pathway, and the sun was just kind of peeking through the trees behind camera position, behind me where I was stood, and just picking up some light on the trunks of the silver birch and the pathway leading you through the image, and I quite like that one. Now I shot this one at several different exposures, and initially it kind of looks like they're very, very similar. Very similar. In fact, that one's slightly darker in the foreground. No, that one's definitely brighter. So that's probably the pick of the bunch, I would think. So that's interesting to see. And then we had this composition. Again, taken at different exposures, so you can, I don't know, you can pick it up on the camera. This one is slightly brighter than this one, and they were taken, I think they were taken at f11, so just with a slightly different shutter speed, so that's good. This one was a little bit challenging on the digital camera because I wanted to make sure that the highlights on the subject's tree trunks weren't blowing out, so I had to underexpose that by around about a stop. So I did the same, transferred the exposure settings, if you like, from the Canon to the Minolta, so it'd be interesting to see what they look like on the computer. In fact, I've even zoomed out a little bit on that one. That looks a little bit different. I can't remember if that was my intention or not, but they do look like very similar exposures, so maybe it's the same exposure. But yeah, quite happy with that one, and that's the slightly zoomed out version. And I actually even tried a vertical image on that one. I don't think I did that with the Canon. Okay, speaking of the Canon camera, I shot this one in a square format, I think it was. So that's quite interesting to see that in a 3x2. Again, a couple of different exposures, and I tried a vertical as well. So they're looking okay. This one I couldn't get close enough, so I had to reposition a tripod for that one. So if you go back into the video in part 3, you'll be able to see exactly what I mean about that one, because there was a tree over on this side that I had to recompose to get the camera to view around that tree, and I couldn't zoom in far enough because of the restrictions of my 28 to 85mm Minolta lens. So that's why that picture is going to be a little bit different to the one on the Canon. Then I took a couple of other pictures which aren't in the video, which turned out not to work. The composition was just too busy, so I've not included those. Things like that. That's what I mean by that. Just a little bit too busy. The composition doesn't really work. I thought it might not at the time, but I shot it anyway. So that was that. I actually did at that location, I think it was, I actually did a panorama on the Canon. So I did about 5 or 6 images, I think it was, and stitched them together. And the panorama seemed to work a little bit better. So I'll show you that now and see what you think. And then moving on to another location of this odd tree with the silver birch backdrop. That seems to work okay. a little bit different again on the Canon. 3 different exposures. That's obviously the darkest, that's the brightest, and that's probably the one I was aiming for. Again, a very different appearance comparing that to the one with the Autumn effect applied to it. And then finally, the final image. This was I think it was the oak trees with the backlit brown fern and bracken on the ground, just coming through. So that one's probably a little bit dark. Those two are very similar, something like that. So they look good. I did shoot a couple of verticals on that, but I don't think the composition really worked. So I think maybe that's not too bad, but a little bit too much sky for my liking, which takes you right away from the real subject of the image, which is this backlit area just here. So that's what I was kind of going for there. A couple of similar images to finish with, just to finish the roll of the film. And that one's not too bad, but you can tell that there are a few overexposed highlights just in the middle here. So probably that one is slightly better, maybe that one or that one, not sure which. So yeah, so I think that was a good result, or an expected result. I don't think it was there are any complete disasters or complete failures in there. But it'll be interesting to compare these now with the digital images. Alright, so here we are now in Lightroom, taking a look at the first batch of images which were taken at Marion Park as part of my test run with the X-9, just to make sure it still shoots. So my final composition of this batch of images was this shot, which was shooting down towards what would have been the antique shop in the film Blow Up. And I reproduced this photograph, this composition, with the Canon digital camera as well. And this time I've reprocessed this in an old sort of 1960s appearance, which I thought was quite appropriate considering the film was shot in 1966. And then leaving Marion Park, we went to the Thames Barrier, and these shots were taken with the black and white film. And then onto the Canon. So here you can see, although I've developed these pictures in Lightroom in my normal kind of editing style, the contrast and the finish and the clarity really is quite punchy compared to the Minolta. So taking a look at all of these in turn, so let's take a look at this one and this one together. You can really see the difference. The digital photograph is just so much clearer. And also bearing in mind that the film image was taken with ISO 400 film. And just to confirm for you as well that on the information here, the digital image was also taken at ISO 400 as well, because I wanted to try and keep the same method of shooting. And then going for the vertical images, again it's a slightly different ratio with the Canon. I think I shot this in a 4:5. Again, you can really see the highlights on the building, and also the detail in the sky, which I've brought out in processing as well. Right, so moving on to Stevington Windmill. This was the first shot I took with the camera film, and I took 2 exposures here. So the first one is either correctly exposed or overexposed, and the right one is underexposed. By comparison, that is the main image that I've ended up with, which I'm quite pleased with. You can see the highlights and shadows in the tree, you get all the details in the foreground, all the details in the sky, and you've got highlights and shadows on the windmill itself. So comparing analog to digital, that's one compared to the other. Again, so much clearer, so much more clarity, and a greater dynamic range in the digital photograph. So moving on to the next composition, This is a range of different exposures with the same composition, and it's interesting to see that on the middle image here it's underexposed, yet the foreground has gone to lighter grey than the one on the left and the one on the right. So it's interesting characteristic. It seems that an interesting characteristic of the Ilford HP5 film, that the more you underexpose it, in a way the lighter the shadows get, but you don't get any detail. So you can really see the grain in the foreground here. There is absolutely no detail at all. But if you underexpose a digital image, you would expect that to go to black. Whereas on this image, the underexposed areas seem to have gone to a grainy, muddy grey. So this one, which is a little bit more correctly exposed, the foreground is a lot darker, yet you pick out more details, which is quite interesting, I think. So let me compare those two. So the correctly exposed or overexposed image on the right, you've got nice cloud details, maybe slightly overexposed here, but the majority of the sky is correctly exposed. And yes, okay, there's the windmill and the tree are silhouetted, but down here in the foreground, although it's dark, there are some details which have been recorded. Whereas the image on the left has been underexposed. You can tell that in the sky because the sky has retained all of its detail, but yet the foreground, there is absolutely no detail at all, yet the foreground is brighter than the foreground on the right. So I think that must be a characteristic of the Ilford HP5 film, that the more you underexpose it, the more the shadows go to a lighter grey, which I think is quite interesting. So perhaps it goes to show that it's actually really quite important with the Ilford black and white film that you go for a correct exposure. So comparing that image, which is probably the best of the bunch from the film camera, comparing that to digital, and that's probably the best of the bunch from the Canon camera. That one, in fact, is a 5 exposure HDR image, so you would expect that one to be amongst the best. And I've also got this one, which is taken with a slightly different sky, waiting for the sky to move across to cover the sun, and that is a normally processed black and white image, which is also quite nice, I think, because you've got a full range of tones, whites to darks, you've got a nice interesting sky, and whilst the tree might be silhouetted, there are still highlights and shadows on the windmill retained. So I'm really happy with that image. And moving on, I'll just cycle through some of these. So these are some these were the running and gunning images, as I call it, from walking around the windmill and shooting without a tripod. Just a few images to go through. And then at the end I put the Minolta onto the tripod to shoot this image, and one is underexposed, one is overexposed. So the one on the left is underexposed. Again, you can see the dark areas of the image have gone to grey. They've not really gone black, so that's quite interesting to see. So there's no real full range of tones on that image, yet details in the sky have been retained, and the image on the right seems to be a little bit better exposed. Again, no real blacks, which is quite interesting, and the sky is a little bit brighter. And comparing that to my digital image, which I'm really happy with, this is obviously processed where the shadows are brightened, the highlights are darkened, and a full range of contrast applied to the image. So again, that one I really do like. and you get a full range of tones, so dark right in the shadows, and then you've got the whites of the sky and a really detailed sky. So I'm really happy with that image. And again, comparing the two, so probably that one, that's the digital versus analog. And once again, as I mentioned earlier, I couldn't go wide enough with my 28 to 85mm lens on the Minolta, so that's the nearest comparison I was able to shoot. Okay, so moving on to home fen. So these three images are the first colour images I shot. Again, all three different exposures, the same composition, but different exposures, just to make sure I got the right one. The first one is underexposed, the second one is overexposed, and probably the one in the middle is this one, which is probably correctly exposed. And it's interesting to see the level of noise and colour noise in the shadows this time with the colour film. And again, the amount of detail captured is not that great actually. You can't really see the level of detail in the leaves around here or the trunk itself. So that's the image, probably the best image taken in analog with the colour film. And comparing that to my Canon digital version, you've got all the frost captured on the leaves in front, the detail on the tree here. Each individual leaf can be picked out on the tree just here. So I think that goes to show that the Canon digital camera can pick out a lot more detail than the Kodak film. So comparing the two, one for the other. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the digital version has the autumn effect applied, which I really think is appropriate for woodland photography. But let's do an experiment. Let's see if we can take this JPEG and develop it to look like this. So good. So that's that image edited. Just make sure that's the right one. Yes. So that's the autumn effect applied and denoised. So comparing that with a digital image, there you go. It's very different. The colours are different. Although that, to be fair, is due to the colour film being used. So let's compare the three images, and we'll take away that one. So that's the before and after of the analog film. It's not a huge amount of difference actually, is there? Okay, so moving on to the next composition and comparing that to the digital image with the autumn effect applied. And there we go. The colours are just so much richer on the digital picture. Quite washed out really on the Kodak colour film. And then these two shots here, again they were taken with the colour film, and again this one on the right is probably overexposed because you're losing the highlights on the tree trunk, so probably that one is the better image I would think. And comparing that to the Canon digital, and like for like, again side by side. So that was the final image we went for. Maybe a tiny bit out of focus, if I have to admit that. But comparing that to the digital picture, again, just much richer in tones. Again with the autumn effect applied, and the detail in the tree trunks is just so much better. The colours are nicer. The colour film just seems to be a little bit cold. Let's just see if we can increase the temperature of this just by going into the develop module, and I'll just increase the temperature and see what happens. If I take it to there, I'll bring down the highlights, increase the texture slightly, I'll bring down the whites. And let's go back to there and compare those now. Oh, a little bit more similar now actually. Quite an interesting comparison. Okay, so moving on, the one on the left is taken on film with the Minolta at 28mm, and the one on the right was taken at 200mm with the 70-200. So that's where I had to take the same subject but recompose slightly to allow for the difference in lenses used. Again, the one on the right, slightly cold. But let's warm it up a little bit. Bring down the highlights. Increase the texture a little bit. What does that do? Colour's a little bit more similar now. I think that one's probably the best one. Just so that we can compare like for like, let's try a square crop. And just going through these film images. That's probably overexposed. That's probably the correct one to compare with the digital picture. And then looking at these final images. So there are the two versions, but I also did another one, which is this one, which I do actually prefer. So I'm going to take this one away. So that is my before and after of the final shot. And I think the digital picture certainly wins out in that one. So to summarise my thoughts then, just a few points really. First of all, the Kodak Ultramax film felt very cold in colour temperature, I thought, compared to my digital images. And I know some of my digital images are quite warm with the things like the Autumn effect applied. But the Kodak Ultramax did seem quite cold in comparison. And, as expected, grain at ISO 400 on both the Ilford and the Kodak Ultramax seemed to be quite apparent, and that was expected. Quite interestingly, if black and white film is underexposed, it seems that the shadows don't necessarily go to black, but they rather go to a grainy, muddy mid-grey. And it seems achieving correct exposure is essential to getting a full range of blacks to whites rather than just grey. I found that developing film is quite expensive nowadays and actually a little bit more difficult to do. It involves doing a Google search and doing a fair amount of research to find the right place to send your films. As far as the cameras are concerned, well, the Minolta X-9 is limited to shooting at full stop increments compared to the third stop increments of digital, and I found that really useful for fine-tuning exposures to make sure my highlights weren't being blown. Also, my fastest shutter speed on the X9 is 1/1000th of a second, so when at the windmill, if I needed to shoot wider open than f11, it may have become a problem. The Canon can shoot 1/8000th. Apparently, it is said that camera film has the equivalent resolution of around 20 megapixels. And I think from my results, my Canon digital camera can resolve much greater detail than the films I used. But then it does have a 30 megapixel sensor, so that does appear to be a true statement. And this may be obvious, but technology brings benefits. Digital brings HDR exposures, bracketing, focus peaking, instant image reviews, and histograms. And they're all features which help us photographers get the shot and get it right first time. I think I have shown that taking the photo is only half the job. Processing on the computer is the other part, and is probably equally as important. as can be seen by comparing developed film and prints to fully processed digital images. So that brings us to the end of my 35mm film project. You know, I've really enjoyed shooting film again with my Minolta X-9. Like I said to you before several times, it's something that I've not done for many years, so it's a real treat to get this out again, and just know that it still works and still produces fantastic results. So like I said, I've really enjoyed it. I hope this has inspired you maybe to go and shoot some film. So thanks for joining me, and please like and subscribe to my channel. Give this video a thumbs up, that would be greatly appreciated. Alright, take care, see you again on the next one. Bye.